Welcome, everyone. This is the IRA drug pricing panel, and we're just going to jump right into it. We're going to be discussing the Inflation Reduction Act's drug pricing provisions and how that implementation is going and how it fits into the larger drug pricing, drug development ecosystem. And so we're just going to jump right into this. And Richard, I want to ask you to kick us off, just for the benefit of our audience, to explain what the drug pricing provisions are in the Inflation Reduction Act and how all of those are meant to work together.
Okay, what is it? A 3,000-page piece of legislation, but I'll get it to you in like 72 seconds. Well, the first piece, which is the one that's kind of furthest along in its implementation, is the inflation rebate program. And under the inflation rebate program, every year the CPI is run against a base year going forward. And if there's a difference between the CPI and the price increases of a particular drug, they need to rebate the difference back to the federal government. And the federal government then puts that into cost sharing. The other part of it is, obviously, if they don't raise their prices, one would expect that the historical levels of price increases would come down, and that's sort of one of the hoped for outcomes. And it's too early to judge, and it's also it is one of the areas of the IRA where there are spillovers into the private sector, because to some extent, particularly on the Part B drugs, the transaction price is actually the price that's being judged against, and so there could be spillovers, and the interplay between commercial shares and Medicare shares is very important here. Second provision, one that's gotten the most attention, which is negotiation. Very early days. First round prices have been announced, and they go into effect in 2026. The negotiations were all conducted underneath a statutory maximum price, or what they call a ceiling price, and the negotiations happened underneath that. And there's a complicated set of procedures, but actually they got put into place on time. Everybody participated, and in general, the quarterly 10Qs and earnings calls suggest that the impacts were modest. Third piece is related to what they call benefit redesign, and that has a couple of pieces. One, it puts into place a out-of-pocket maximum, which gets fully phased in next year, $2,000. It changes the cost sharing on vaccines to zero, and it reduces the out-of-pocket costs to insulin products to $35 a month out of pocket. And then probably the most important thing that has gotten the least attention is that the incentives on the pharmacy benefit managers have changed pretty dramatically. Before, if you were in the reinsurance segment, the government picked up 80% of the costs, consumers picked up 5%, and the PBMs were on the hook for 15%. Now that's been changed so that the government is on the hook 20%, the PBMs are on the hook 60%, and then there's a mandatory rebate or discount from the industry, and the consumers now pay zero out of pocket because it's now under the cap. And that pretty dramatically changes the pricing incentives there. And then the final thing is that the low-income subsidies have been expanded, and that brings more people into highly subsidized premiums and cost sharing.
Yeah, so quite a number of provisions and a lot of moving pieces there. So as far as the implementation of this, again, as Richard has alluded to, a lot of the attention has been on this negotiation program. I think in no small part because the drug companies have sued over those provisions, viewing them as being overly coercive, and so I think, to Richard's point, that's really important, is that in terms of the negotiations, they ended up being a relatively light touch in terms of the prices that were negotiated. The industry quite frequently has cited in their investment calls that this was not as bad as they thought it was going to be. So as far as, though, the implementation, that process, any thoughts from the panel in terms of how that process went in terms of the negotiations, and what does that portend going forward? Anybody have thoughts on that?
Thank you. So I want to, before we go into the implementation details, let's talk about the budgetary impact. So I served as a visiting scholar at CBO, Congressional Budget Office, 2022, 2023. So I want to talk about the new evidence and new estimate, new numbers from CBO. So let's think about this IRA drug provisions. It was designed in a way to generate savings for green energy, right? So look at the numbers. The original CBO estimate, $160 billion saving from drug negotiation for the next 10 years. And then because of the benefit redesign, as Dr. Frank just mentioned, that will cost taxpayers, will cost the federal budget $30 billion in the next 10 years. So we have $160 billion savings from negotiation and the $30 billion additional costs. So net savings how much? $130 billion, right? But now new evidence surfaced that the saving might not be there, or might be much lower than original, the additional cost will be much higher than original estimated, the $30 billion. Why? Let's look at the most recent 2025 bids. The bid, I'm talking about the standalone Part D bid, already almost tripled than last year. So that caused the Biden administration to initiate this stabilization demonstration, right? So how much is that? CBO's number tells us is $5 billion a year just for 2025. For the next 10 years, the interest is going to be $1 to $2 billion. So we're here looking at about $60 to $70 billion just from this new demonstration. So why is that? Because the drug spending went up more than estimated. So it is totally safe to ask, are we really going to get as much saving as originally anticipated? But where the money went, the money already got earmarked for green energy. All right, so that's budgetary implication. There are many other consequences beyond budgetary implications. Number one, how about the new drugs? So also new data showing that clinical trials R&D activities dropped after IRA. People might say, look, we already got a $2,000 cap on drug companies, so drug companies should be very happy. Actually, they are happy whenever you have a cap, right? That is a very good news for revenue. However, on the other hand, we have a very questionable message for R&D. Why? If you look at small molecule, biologic, all those negotiation and the uncertainty you impose on drug company. So if you're a drug company, what do you fear most would be uncertainty. I'm talking about early stage biotech company. So this is a very questionable incentive. That's why we're seeing the early evidence on R&D very negative. Now, going to the benefit redesign and the consequence on the Part D market, we are seeing 26% drop in the number of Part D standalone plans. That limit access to right now standalone Part D beneficiaries. So 33.5 million people are forced out of those plans because their plans are gone. So where are they going? Very likely where? Medicare Advantage, right? But remember the past 4 years, Biden administration has done a lot of regulatory constraints on those Medicare Advantage plan. They already experienced 1.5 million beneficiaries having their plans, Medicare Advantage plans, terminated. So now the question is, where do these people go? They are losing their Medicare Part D standalone plan. Now the Medicare Advantage plan also having all those issues. So I think for the new administration, this has to be addressed as a consequence of the IRA. So let me just quickly summarize. The budgetary savings are not there, right? As you mentioned, the $130 billion in 10 years, not there. The consequences on new drugs are substantial. And we also have a shortage on generics. That's because of the inflation rebate. So overall, we have a shortage on new drugs and a shortage on existing generic drugs. Beyond that, our Medicare Part D standalone plan market completely got destabilized. And then the Medicare Advantage plan also facing all the challenges. So I would say the consequences cannot be overemphasized. And think this really need some very careful examination on both budgetary implication and the non-financial consequences. Thank you.
So I'm Jacob Brody, the co-founder and CEO of ZorroCard. We use 340B discounts to lower the price of drugs for independent Medicare Advantage plans and self-insured employers. Every single one of the Medicare negotiated prices is above the 340B price. So this is an existing discount that has existed since 1992, and it is cheaper. I personally have negotiated and sell to my clients, including all of my fees. I beat the Emerald price at the IRA. How can a company, we are much smaller than the government, how are we getting better pricing? Well, it's because the drug companies have to use 340B or they don't get Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement. And so that's negotiation. And I think what the IRA was doing was trying to say, the left had a green energy agenda that they wanted to fund. And so the easiest way to do this was with math that was a little fuzzy. And we all know that drug companies are going to make their money, and it was just a fantasy that that anything else was going to happen. I think what we really need to look at is the role of pharma companies. They're not really getting as much of the money as we think. When you look at drugs like Ozempic and Mounjaro, which is a big part of, Ozempic will be in next year's drug negotiations, the net pricing after rebates is like $290. So I think the place I really want to look is less about, IRA reductions and the fact that we're subsidizing, big PBMs that are just taking our money and they're doing nothing. I take $100,000 worth of drugs and there's no reason it should cost $100,000 list price.
I just want to add a couple of points to Dr. Bay's point. First of all, the numbers that she cited on the attribution of the IRA's redesign to the budget increase actually has been revised by CBO. They recently put out a document that outlines that, in fact, when they reanalyzed the data, because they too thought it was attributable to the benefit redesign, the biggest factor is that in 23, there was an enormous run-up in costs, and that's what drove the projections for the premium increases that you're seeing. And they've just issued a corrective to their earlier comments on that. So I think it's probably important to actually sort out what's really going on and get the attribution right before we kind of make a conclusion about exactly what the redesign has done. Second, on R&D, all the data that I've seen out there, that the CBO is seeing, that other independent researchers have looked at suggests that, in fact, since the enactment of the IRA, R&D intensity has increased, and the number of mergers and acquisitions and partnerships involving early stage developments has increased. And that is off of trend. So there's been actually an upward spike in those activities. Then just one last point is that on shortages have been around since about the turn of the century. And so blaming that on the inflation rebate program is kind of a stretch. And I think that shortages are a fact of life, and it's mostly due to the way that we pay for generic drugs, because in fact it's generic drugs that are in shortage, not brand name drugs, because there are incentives for generics to underinvest in plant capacity and quality are very weak right now.
So, yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about sort of the benefit redesign and whether that's having an impact on the broader market, on premium pricing and those kinds of things. In terms of, I guess, in terms of like the negotiation program, the inflation rebates, the benefit redesign, all of that, based on the experience that we've had, how should we expect these to be implemented under now a new Trump administration? Should we expect that this program will continue, at least for now? How would the negotiations, do we think, how would those go forward under the Trump administration? Would they kind of remain the same? Would they be less aggressive? What do you guys think about that?
I think you're going to see new creativity outside of the IRA negotiations, but the IRA price negotiations are a failure. Like, they don't work, and that's because they were done with faulty math. And so it's not going to lead to the outcome that we want. So you're going to see people, even if you lower the prices in the negotiation, the Part D formularies are just going to move to the high rebate, high list price drugs, and you're not going to see the savings enacted. So we just need new legislation. It was just bad legislation.
If I may add, I agree with Jacob. I think the negotiation part is under risk in the new administration. The cap, the $200 annual cap, will probably stay because why? Lobby, right? Drug companies really like that, because think about if your product have this price cap, then people don't have the price sensitivity. Of course, you would love that, right? That will increase your sales. So I think that part is probably safer, but not like 100% safe. But the negotiation part, I believe is under risk. So let me just comment on Dr. Frank's 3 points. I love those 3 points. Thank you very much. So number one, actually, I recently wrote an article on Forbes talking about the budgetary impact of IRA. The CBO did make it very clear the stabilization that program demonstration cost $5 billion a year. So if we time 10, that's $50 billion, 10 years. And then the interest is $1 to $2 billion. So that's about, we are looking at around $60 billion. So that is not disputed. Then CBO did make it very clear that they underestimated the spending increase. So that's due to 2023 higher drug spending. They said it's largely attributed. They did not say that this redesign did not play a role. So exactly how much we don't know. However, it is safe to say the redesign played a role in the increase of their estimates. So how much we really need to figure out how. But the fact is it will be high. It did play a role. Therefore, I believe the budgetary impact of this redesign, all the redesign measures will be worse than CBO initially anticipated, simply because the demonstration as well as the higher than anticipated spending from the redesign. The second part regarding the new drug. So I was citing two pieces of information from number one from the House Affairs Forefront recently, and the other one's from National Pharmaceutical Council. So they have a nice chart from three economists showing this reduction in clinical trials. So I think still it's too early to tell. However, if you look at the CBO's original estimate, they did say that the IRA will reduce number of new drugs. What's being challenged or being discussed is really how many new drugs will be reduced, right? But I think there's no question that number of new drugs will be reduced simply because the incentive is distorted.
I also
so number
think it's
three,
which drugs will be produced
Exactly.
because you're going to see biologics and autoimmune drugs produced, but new cancer drugs are going to go down because it's not as good a financial return.
Exactly. It's what drugs and how many. It's not about whether new drugs will be reduced. So number three, about the generic drug shortage. So I with Joantos at AEI, we had a piece in the Hill talking about the generic drug shortage is caused by many factors, but one of the factors is the inflation penalty. So think of yourself as the manufacturer of generic drugs. If you are sensing some shortage coming, what would you do? You would increase your price and expand your production, right? That's how you make money. But then because the Medicaid has saying you can't increase your price more than inflation, then guess what? Your incentive to expand the production got reduced. It's still there, but reduced, right? So you are less likely to respond actively to shortage. That is one of many reasons causing our generic drug shortages. But now, guess what? The IRA says not just Medicaid, we're going to do the same for Medicare. So to us, or people who think like me, would be this is adding fuel to fire, right? So we are now have Medicare and Medicaid both have the inflation penalty on drugs, including the generic drugs. So how can you expect them to jack up production when they sense shortage? And how can you really mobilize those manufacturers to deal with shortage? So the ideal case would be, okay, this is shortage, I increase my price, I increase my production, then we'll reach equilibrium, right? And then the price will stabilize and everybody got the drug. So the shortage resolved. But now the problem is, okay, we had a shortage, the price cannot go up, then I'm going to be very lukewarm. I won't really expand my production because money is not there. Then we have prolonged shortage. And beyond that, that creates incentive for drug companies to want to be on the shortage list, which is another whole issue. But my point is, IRA does not address the fundamental problems for generic drug shortages, actually adding the problems by itself. Thank you.
I wanted to jump into, based on some of the points that have been made, in terms of the drug development ecosystem in general. I think there is some misunderstanding as to the effects of some of these policies on R&D activity and on drug development. I think to the point that Jacob was saying that these provisions could affect or decrease the number of cancer drugs that are developed. I would just add that if we were to look at and really dig into some of the clinical trial data that got certain drugs like sotorasib approved, Lumacris, it's very questionable whether that drug has any sort of positive effect on the patients it's intending to serve. And so to the extent that some of those drugs may not be approved, I'm not sure that that's going to have the public health impact that the drug companies would want us to believe. But beyond that, we at FREOPP are going to be publishing a paper soon on the effects of the IRA on the particular companies involved and what we could expect in terms of decrements to their revenue, to R&D spending. And what we find there is similar to what we've found in a study that we published recently looking at some of these biggest drug companies and what would happen if there were certain policies in place that would lower their revenues. And what we find is that this link of high prices equals innovation is way overblown. And that in the case of the companies involved, that for the 10 drugs that have been negotiated, they will be able to weather this quite easily and will be able to continue their drug development and continue their pipelines pretty much unabated. The last point I would add too is that I think there are certain corners that feel that these negotiation programs are overly coercive, and that's understandable given the fact that it's kind of a take it or leave it sort of scenario, right? You've got these companies that obviously they want to sell their drugs in Medicare and Medicaid. It's a big part of their business. And so for them to be able to say, well, if we don't agree to this price, then we'll just pull out of this market. That's not really an option for those companies. That being said, from a constitutional perspective, that is still an option for them. So the lawsuits that are challenging the constitutionality based on the fact that this is a violation of the takings clause just doesn't have any merit. And we're seeing those cases getting dismissed. I'm quite frankly surprised that all of them haven't been dismissed by now. They're kind of dragging on a little bit. But all of this is to say that when we look at just these decrements to revenue and R&D, they're pretty small. And even so, even if we view the law as being coercive, I would have a solution for that, and that is patent and FDA exclusivity reform. Let's not allow drug companies to be able to sell their drug without competition like AbbVie did with Humira for 20 years. If we were to tighten those laws and ensure that drug companies have the runway they need to recoup their investment, but not be allowed to continually raise their price over a 20-year period or even a 15-year period, we could do something like have both small molecules and biologics have 8 years of FDA exclusivity rather than the 5 for small molecules and 12 for biologics we have under current law. And so if we were to harmonize that, we would eliminate this bias toward developing more biologics over small molecule drugs. We would harmonize that, but we would also create a time window that is reasonable for the drug company to profit off of that, while also ensuring that generic and biosimilar competition enters sooner. And when that happens, you make the IRA drug negotiation program obsolete, because that program doesn't select those drugs until at least they've been on the market at least 9 years in the case of small molecules, 13 for biologics. So if we were to really tighten those windows, we wouldn't even need the IRA in order to introduce more competition into the market.
I mean, I think one of the things that, when the IRA was being passed, I was like, is this just trying to make up for the sins of the ACA, where you did vertical integration, which caused all the prices to go up because the PBMs are getting their pound of flesh, and that was caused because the health insurers bought them because they needed to. And this is all just flowing downhill from the ACA. If we started to really look at just PBMs, that's where I think the real problem is, because net pricing, the gross to net, it's just huge. List prices are way higher than what people are actually paying.
So what of that argument, though, that I think other people would counter that and say, well, it's drug companies that are setting the prices to begin with. So does some onus rest on them? And I ask that because there is wide bipartisan agreement to deal with PBMs. I think that's one of the areas of drug policy that has a really good chance of being addressed in one form or another in the next Congress. But what would you say to that? And what should we do with PBMs? How should we reform those to make that market work better?
So ZorroCard works with independent PBMs. So I want to make sure the term PBM, pharmacy benefits manager, is not evil. But the ones that own group purchasing organizations, they own rebate aggregators, they negotiate for all of the PBMs, not just the one they own, because they're the only ones that are big enough. They're like 3 that do all the negotiation, and they take their pound of flesh. Those 3 have no purpose. They just take money from the taxpayer, and that's a subsidy, and I'm not about that, right? The independent PBMs, they just charge a fee for each drug each prescription they process. That's a good business, and we should be working with pass-through 100% PBMs, and then what happens is the drug companies just keep raising the price so that they can afford the rebate. Let's look at Ozempic and Mounjaro. You're talking about net prices of $290 for Ozempic and $215 for Mounjaro, according to AEI research. And so where does the rest of that money go? Well, that's going to, rebates.
Thank you. So where does the rebate go? I love Jacob's question. If we look at the CBO estimate for the Trump administration's regulation that let's give patients point of sale rebates, only take into account the pharmacy, their direct, indirect remuneration. So that's like pharmacy rebates put at the point of sale. What happened is that the premium will go up. So the rebates come back to reduce plan premium. That is one headwind against the reforms of PBMs. Because people, like Medicare Part D, get the rebates and reduce premiums, although I'm not saying 100%, but portion of the rebates. And also a under-discussed issue is that many plan sponsors on the commercial market want the rebates. They like the fact they get a quarterly check from the manufacturers, and that can be used for at their discretion for benefit purposes. So I think when we talk about the PBM reform, we have to make sure what do we want to achieve. If our goal is just to weaken PBMs, guess what? We're probably going to wait for the premium to go up. Right, because PBM, it's really something standing between higher price and drug company, and also there to play a role, putting pressure on pharmacies. So I would really ask everyone to think clearly what's the goal. If the goal is to help patients, then if you look at the state level PBM reforms, our study shows there's no evidence that state level reforms are actually helping patients. Many cases, these are results of regulatory capture. Some stakeholders fighting with PBMs, they go into the process and get the law passed at the state level. But the result is those interests got benefit, but patients and plan sponsors don't really see a benefit at the pharmacy counter or at the year end.
Well, you can lower costs. It happens. We do it average 40%, and that's post rebate. So it's just that the big PBMs are making money for doing nothing. Like I'm all about private enterprise. I'm not about private criminal organizations.
Well, I agree that the vertical integration is at the heart of the problem, and that it's a self-inflicted wound. I disagree about who inflicted it. If you read the recent complaint by the FTC about PBMs, basically what they're doing is they're walking back 25 years of policy, Justice Department as well. And so, we've had opportunities repeatedly over the last 20 years to prevent this, and it's been antitrust sleepiness, if you will, that's, I think, at the heart of the matter, and that crosses going back to Bush, Obama, Trump, all of them were asleep at the switch. And so, I would say that the, ACA was a sideshow to that.
I would agree with that.
I would as well.
Integration, regulation.
And so, so we've got just a few minutes left. So I want to make sure we open the floor to any questions that you may have for us.
I was just curious if you guys have any thoughts on how the IRA and drug price negotiation affected the election. I know the Biden campaign made a very big deal about it, but in my opinion, it didn't seem to have as much of an effect as they expected.
Biden was a very unpopular president. Probably the thing that he did that was most popular was the IRA. And so I think that, if anything, that helped. It's just the, dozen other things that people didn't like that I think were the undoing.
So Let me quickly add. I think it's really forward-looking, right? So Dr. Frank knows this. It's really starting from 2025. But then Biden administration did use the demonstration to stabilize the premium, because premium really going to drop if Biden administration did not use the demonstration program to put in $5 billion a year. But also there's a green energy issue resonated with some voters, because this IRA generated billions of dollars to put into green energy. Yeah. But in terms of really, as a counter effect, that's starting going to be at least a year from now.
And I would just add to that, I think the data is pretty solid that economic issues and inflation were at the heart of what we saw. In particular, this dichotomy between those who feel that they are better off than they were 4 years ago voted overwhelmingly for Harris, whereas those who felt that they were worse off than 4 years ago voted overwhelmingly for Trump. And so I think that was the main dynamic at play. And quite frankly, I'm always a bit miffed by the idea that when you look at healthcare, it's close to 20% of our GDP. So it's a huge part of the costs that everyday Americans deal with. And yet healthcare was like almost never talked about during the campaign. It just wasn't an issue this time around. I'm not exactly sure why that wasn't the case. I think maybe on the Republican side, they probably tend to avoid it a bit because of the wounds they feel from the 2017 experience with the repeal and replace, and they just don't want to go there. The Biden-Harris administration did play up the drug negotiations, but as Gay said, like, that is forward looking. It's not going into effect, those lower prices, until later on. So Americans aren't feeling that. Seniors aren't feeling that right now. And I think to a certain extent, Americans, they know something is wrong with, in particular, the prescription drug market. It's one of those contact points that more Americans have contact with than, say, hospitals. There's millions and millions of Americans that go to a pharmacy every month or every 3 months to renew their prescriptions. They're not using hospitals as often or even going to the doctor as often. And so that's a contact point that has extra salience for Americans is drug pricing. At the same time, if you're insured and you have a decent health plan, you're not feeling the effects of that much either. If you just have a few generic prescriptions that you buy and you're paying $5-10 copay, you're not feeling that all that much. And so even to the extent that Americans would be feeling that personally, it's a very small subset of people that have those higher prescription drug costs, in particular if they're taking specialty drugs, mail order specialty drugs. But all of this is to say that I think this election was about how each individual felt personally in terms of their own financial situation. And so in that respect, I don't think this issue would have as much salience.
With what you were saying about not many people take those specialty drugs, like my personal medications list price is over $100,000 a year, right? I'm part of the 1%, but it's that 1% that drives over 25% of costs. It's 15% of members that are over 75% of cost. The bottom 50% are 3% of costs, right? It's all that like big spender. And for folks like me, my copays are going up in private plans. My deductibles are going up. My out-of-pocket max is going up. And I think that has nothing to do with the Inflation Reduction Act right now. I think in the next 4 years, we're going to have to deal with it because it's chronic disease medications. I'm not sick and then I'm cured. I take insulin. I take Skyrizi. I take Mounjaro. I take these things for the rest of my life. And so that's going to be a big budgetary problem.
I'd say one other quick point too. When you look at the benefit redesign and all of that, when he's talking about there's a very small subset that have these high costs, they end up getting felt though by everyone through higher premiums. And when you look at private insurance compared to the percentage that drugs cost in terms of our national health expenditures is always around 10%, hovering around there. But for private premium dollars, it's 24 cents out of every premium dollar. So this cost is high, but it's being felt and spread by everyone. Everyone's carrying that load together. But again, in terms of the election, in terms of, you know, how people will vote, they often don't make that connection between the higher premium levels and those higher drug costs.
Yeah. So and just in context for my question, I work for a Medicare Advantage company, and a few years ago, I had a project to try and calculate the rebates on the prescription drugs we were getting claims for. And after 5 months of working with CVS, we just could not get them to tell us how much they were going to rebate us. They were basically like, we'll tell you in a year once we do all of our calculations. So my question is, it seems like there's it's really hard to get transparency in this industry. Is there any policy changes or anything we would do through legislation to improve that situation?
I mean, there's a lot of things you can do from a policy perspective, but also I think plan sponsors on the commercial side, and like you could go to Navitus, they're 100% pass through. There are things that you could do. Happy to make an introduction to their leadership team, by the way. And there are 100% pass through PBMs. And I think right now that is what we need to be focusing on, is making sure that Medicare Advantage firms that are taking our government money aren't just giving it to, you know, the left hand of the company is handing it to the right hand of the company. The vertical integration. I think, you know, I'm worried about making a PBM a fiduciary because there's all sorts of things with that. But if it's taxpayer money, why should you just take it from me for no good reason?
Okay. I think if we look at the existing bills in both chambers, probably the area with the biggest overlap would be transparency, right? Delinking or fiduciary, those are being advocated by some members, but I don't think the momentum is as strong as transparency. But then we should not be overly optimistic with the impact of transparency, right? Let's be frank, there are many large employers could have imposed transparency just based on its size, but hasn't really happened, right? So I think that's probably gonna happen, transparency, some bill to some form. But in terms of really what do that are they gonna bite? We should wait and see. Thank you.
I think we can end it on that. But lots to think about. This is a rapidly changing part of health policy, and it should be an interesting next couple years for sure. Thank you to everyone on the panel, and thank you.